Hello, everyone, friends. I hope you enjoy listening to and watching this interesting story. There's a particular quality to the light on a summer evening when it catches the chrome of an old automobile, the way it transforms a metal into something almost liquid, almost alive. Perhaps you remember it. The sun hanging low over Main Street, casting long shadows across pavement, still warm from the day, and there, parked at an angle in front of the Five and Dime, a car that seemed to embody everything America promised in those years after the war. Not just transportation, but transformation itself, rendered in steel and paint and possibility. The story of America's old cars is not simply a chronicle of engineering or commerce, though it is certainly both of those things. It is the story of a nation learning to move, to dream in motion, to imagine itself accelerating into a future that stretched out like the new interstate highways, endless and inviting. It is the story of families and freedom, of Sunday drives and first dates, of the moment when an entire generation looked at the road ahead and saw not limitation, but invitation. In the years immediately following the Second World War, something remarkable happened in the industrial heartland of America. The factories that had churned out tanks and aircraft and the machinery of war turned their attention to a different kind of production. The workers who had built bombers began building automobiles, and they brought with them not just skill, but a sense of purpose, a collective determination to create something beautiful in a world that had seen too much destruction. Detroit became more than a city. It became a verb, an adjective, a promise. The cars that emerged from those assembly lines in the late 1940s carried with them the weight of victory and the lightness of relief. They were utilitarian still, practical vehicles for a practical people, but even then you could see the beginnings of something else. The designers were starting to dream. The engineers were starting to imagine. Chrome trim appeared where it wasn't strictly necessary. Colors became bolder. The proportions began to shift, to lengthen, to suggest movement even when standing still. But it was the 1950s that truly transformed the American automobile from mere conveyance into cultural icon. The decade arrived like a guest who had been expected for years, and it brought with it a sense of exuberance, of confidence, of sheer unrestrained optimism that would define not just the cars but the entire era. The economy was expanding, families were growing, the suburbs were spreading outward in concentric circles from city centers, and every new house seemed to come with a driveway that demanded to be filled. The designers looked to the sky for inspiration, to the jet aircraft that streaked overhead, leaving contrails across the endless blue. They saw rockets and spacecraft in the drawings of futurists and engineers, and they thought, why not bring that sense of tomorrow into today? Why not make every morning commute feel like a journey into the future? And so the tail fins appeared, those glorious, impractical, utterly unnecessary extensions of metal that transformed sedans into something that looked ready for flight. They started modestly enough, small protrusions that hinted at aerodynamics, at speed, at the jet age. But by the mid-50s, they had become bold declarations, sweeping upward and backward, catching the light, demanding attention. The Chevrolet Bel Air emerged as something more than transportation. With its tri-tone paint schemes and its chrome-laden smile of a grille, it represented aspiration made affordable. It was the car of the man who had worked his way up from the factory floor to foreman, of the young couple buying their first home in Levittown, of the family that had saved for 2 years to afford something new, something that smelled of fresh upholstery and possibility. On Saturday mornings, fathers waxed them in driveways while children played in the spray of sprinklers. And the act of caring for the car became a ritual, a meditation, a way of saying, we have arrived, we have made it, we are part of this prosperous, promising America. Ford answered with the Fairlane, a name borrowed from Henry Ford's own estate, suggesting that elegance and accessibility need not be mutually exclusive. The Crown Victoria model wore its chrome top like a crown indeed, a band of stainless steel that wrapped around the roofline, catching sunlight and turning ordinary street corners into something approaching glamorous. These were cars that made their owners feel important, that transformed a trip to the grocery store into something worth dressing up for. But perhaps no vehicle captured the pure, unfiltered essence of 1950s automotive ambition quite like the Cadillac Eldorado. It was excess made elegant luxury distilled into sheet metal and leather and enough chrome to furnish a jewelry store. The tail fins reached toward the heavens as if attempting to escape gravity altogether. The interior wrapped its occupants in comfort that seemed almost decadent, with power everything, from windows to seats to the mind itself, which couldn't help but expand in the presence of such opulence. To drive an El Dorado was to make a statement, to announce arrival not just at a destination, but at a certain station in life. The colors of these cars deserve their own chapter in the story. They weren't simply painted. They were adorned in hues that had names like tropical turquoise and coral pink and Apache yellow. Two-tone combinations created visual rhythms along the body, separating hood from roof from trunk in compositions that required genuine artistic consideration. The paint itself was deep, glossy, reflecting the world back in saturated tones that made everything seem more vivid, more alive. Walking through a parking lot in 1956 was like walking through an art gallery where every piece was functional, where beauty served purpose and purpose served beauty. The interiors of these automobiles created worlds unto themselves. Bench seats upholstered in vinyl or cloth, or, in the more luxurious models, genuine leather, stretched wide enough to seat three comfortably. There were no separate bucket seats then, no center consoles creating barriers between driver and passenger. Families sat together, couples sat close, and the interior space felt communal, democratic, a shared experience of travel. The dashboards presented themselves as control panels from some idealized future, with chrome bezels surrounding gauges that glowed in warm, amber light once darkness fell. Knobs and buttons promised climate control, and radio stations and windows that rose and fell at the touch of a finger. The radios themselves were portals to a wider world. Turn the dial and you could pull in stations from hundreds of miles away on a clear night, the signal bouncing off the ionosphere, bringing music and news and voices from distant cities. Young people discovered rock and roll through those speakers while their parents tuned in to big band broadcasts and news programs. The car became a private concert hall, a mobile living room, a space where the outside world could be invited in or shut out as desired. Perhaps you remember the sound, not just the radio, but the mechanical symphony of the automobile itself. The door closing with a solid, satisfying thunk that spoke of substantial construction, of steel and craftsmanship. The engine turning over, that initial growl settling into a steady rumble, the transmission engaging with a definitive clunk. These cars announced themselves. They had presence. They had voice. The V8 engine became the beating heart of American automotive culture. 8 cylinders firing in sequence, producing power that felt limitless, acceleration that pressed you back into the seat. The engineers had learned to extract performance from displacement, to create engines that could move these increasingly large vehicles with surprising alacrity. The sound of a V8 at full throttle was something that stirred the soul, a deep-throated roar that spoke of unleashed horses, of freedom measured in horsepower. Cruising Main Street on a Friday night became a ritual in towns across America. The cars moved in slow procession, windows down, radios playing, young people seeing and being seen. It was courtship and community, rebellion and belonging all at once. The local drive-in restaurant became the center of this universe, where car hops delivered hamburgers and milkshakes directly to the window, where the automobile transformed from transportation into destination, into gathering place, into the very stage upon which teenage life was performed. For families, the car enabled migration patterns that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. Sunday drives became traditions, excursions into the countryside or along the coast, journeys undertaken not because they were necessary, but because they were possible, because the car and the newly improved roads invited exploration. Parents packed children into the back seat, along with picnic baskets and beach toys and whatever else the adventure required, and they ventured out into an America that was still discovering itself, still building itself, still paving roads into territories that had known only wagon trails and dirt paths. The vacation trip by automobile became an American institution. Families would plan for months, charting routes on maps that folded and unfolded until the creases threatened to tear, marking stops at motor lodges and tourist attractions, at national parks and roadside wonders. The journey itself became as important as the destination. Children pressed faces against windows, counting license plates from distant states, playing games that made the miles pass more quickly. Rest stops became social spaces where travelers from different regions mingled briefly, comparing notes on road conditions and recommended routes, united by the shared experience of travel. Consider the story of a man named William. Though he could have been named Robert or James or any of the common names of that generation, he saved for 3 years to buy his first new car, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in a shade of blue that reminded him of the Pacific Ocean he had seen during the war. He was 32 years old, married with 2 young children, working as a manager at a hardware store in a small Ohio town. The day he drove that car home from the dealership, his wife came out onto the porch and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that they had achieved something, that they were living proof that hard work and patience could be rewarded with something beautiful. William kept that car for 23 years. He washed it every Sunday after church, touching up small chips in the paint, replacing worn parts with careful attention. His children learned to drive in that car, grinding the gears until they found the rhythm, stalling at stop signs until they mastered the clutch. His daughter left for college with her belongings packed in the trunk. His son brought home his first serious girlfriend for dinner, parking that Bel Air carefully in the driveway, hoping the car might impress where his own awkward charm fell short. The car became a repository of memory, every scratch and stain associated with some story, some moment, some chapter in the family narrative. Or think of Margaret, you who bought a used 1954 Ford Crestline in mint green when her husband passed away suddenly in 1962. She was 51 years old and had never driven before. Her husband had always been the driver, the navigator, the one who dealt with mechanical things. But she refused to be stranded, refused to be dependent, refused to let fear dictate her mobility. She took lessons from a patient instructor who understood that learning to drive at 51 was about more than operating machinery. It was about reclaiming autonomy, about moving forward when everything felt like it was falling away. That Ford Crestline became her declaration of independence. She drove it to the grocery store, to church, to visit her sister 3 towns over. She drove it until she was 78 years old, and her children gently suggested it might be time to stop. She agreed, but she never sold the car. It sat in her garage until the day she died, a talisman, a reminder that she had refused to be defeated. The automotive culture of the 1950s extended far beyond the vehicles themselves. It encompassed the entire ecosystem that grew up around them. Service stations became social hubs where mechanics in crisp uniforms pumped gas and checked oil and washed windshields while chatting with customers about weather and sports and local news. The station owner was a figure of respect in the community, someone who understood the machines that had become so central to daily life, someone who could diagnose problems by sound alone and repair them with skill and patience. Drive-in movie theaters capitalized on the automobile's cultural centrality, creating entertainment venues where the car became the theater seat. Families arrived before dusk to secure the best spots, hanging speakers on the window and settling in as twilight deepened and the massive screen came to life. Young couples found privacy in the back rows, the car providing both conveyance and venue for courtship. The intermission brought a migration to the snack bar, a procession of vehicles emptying out and then filling again with refreshments and anticipation. The styling of these automobiles reflected broader cultural currents flowing through America in those years. The optimism of the post-war period manifested in chrome and color. The fascination with space exploration and jet travel influenced every curve and line. The prosperity that allowed families to afford such vehicles was built on an economy that was expanding, on industries that were thriving, on a sense that America's trajectory was upward, forward, faster. The cars were not merely products of this culture. They were expressions of it, physical manifestations of a particular moment in the nation's story. By the late 1950s, the styling had reached its apex. The 1959 Cadillac stood as perhaps the ultimate expression of this aesthetic philosophy, with tail fins that soared to heights that seemed to defy practical purpose, with headlights that peered out from beneath chrome-hooded cowls, with so much ornamentation that the car seemed almost baroque. It was magnificent and excessive and utterly sincere in its ambition. Looking at it now, it might seem overwrought, but in its moment, it represented something genuine. The belief that more was better, that tomorrow would be grander than today, that style and substance could coexist in glorious harmony. The mechanics of these vehicles were comprehensible to the average owner in ways that would become increasingly rare. A man with basic tools and reasonable patience could tune his own engine, replace his own spark plugs, adjust his own carburetor. The relationship between owner and automobile was more intimate then, more hands-on. You didn't just drive the car, you maintained it, understood it, developed a feel for its particular quirks and characteristics. Every vehicle had its own personality, its own preferred starting procedure on cold mornings, its own way of communicating through sounds and sensations when something needed attention. The used car lots of the early 1960s displayed these machines as they began their second and third lives. Vehicles that had carried their original owners through years of service now waited for new families, new stories, new chapters. A car that had been purchased new in 1953 might find itself, 10 years later, serving as a teenager's first vehicle, or as economical transportation for a young family just starting out, or as a project car for an enthusiast who saw beneath the wear and tear to the beauty that remained. The cars were built to last, engineered with an assumption of longevity that would seem almost quaint by later standards. As the decade turned toward the 1960s, the styling began to shift. The fins started to shrink, to retract, as if the designers were gently bringing the vehicles back down to earth. The emphasis moved from pure decoration toward performance, toward power, toward vehicles that could deliver on the promise of speed that their predecessors had only suggested. But those 1950s automobiles had established something that would endure. The idea that cars could be more than transportation, that they could be art, that they could be statements of identity and aspiration. The cultural influence of these vehicles extended into every corner of American life. They appeared in movies and television shows, sometimes as transportation, but often as characters in their own right, as symbols of status or freedom or rebellion, depending on the context. Rock and roll songs celebrated them, immortalizing specific makes and models in lyrics that teenagers memorized and sang. Artists painted them, and photographers captured them, novelists described them in prose that tried to convey not just what they looked like, but what they meant. The automobile industry itself became a defining American institution. Detroit employed hundreds of thousands, from assembly line workers to executives, from designers to dealers. The companies competed fiercely, each trying to anticipate what the public would want next year, next season, next month. The annual model change became an event, with new vehicles unveiled with fanfare and anticipation. Showrooms filled with people who came just to look, to admire, to dream about what they might someday afford. For African American families, the automobile represented something additional and profound. In an era when segregation laws still governed much of the country, when hotels and restaurants might refuse service based on skin color, the car offered a measure of autonomy and dignity, the ability to travel without dependence on segregated public transportation, to bring food and necessities without having to stop at establishments that didn't welcome them, transformed the automobile from luxury to necessity. The Negro Motorist Green Book guided Black travelers to safe stops and welcoming businesses. And the car that carried them became a vehicle of resistance, of self-determination, of refusal to accept limitation. The parking lots of shopping centers told stories in their arrangements. The newest models near the front, carefully positioned where they'd be seen and admired. The working vehicles of employees relegated to the back rows. The classic cars of enthusiasts who had kept their 1950s vehicles running well into subsequent decades, refusing to trade them in, unable to let go of what they represented. Each vehicle carried with it a history, a narrative that included not just where it had been, but who had ridden in it, what had happened within its confines, what role it had played in the living of lives. Consider how these automobiles witnessed the most intimate moments of human experience. They were present at first kisses stolen in the darkness of Lover's Lane. They carried newborns home from hospitals, precious cargo wrapped in blankets, new parents driving with exaggerated caution. They transported elderly grandparents on what would be their final rides to see the old neighborhoods, the familiar streets. They served as confessionals where teenagers and parents had difficult conversations, where siblings worked through conflicts, where friends shared secrets. The privacy of the automobile interior created a space where vulnerability was possible, where difficult truths could be spoken. The maintenance and care of these vehicles became a form of meditation for many. Saturday mornings spent in the garage or driveway, hands occupied with familiar tasks, while the mind wandered or settled or worked through problems that had seemed insurmountable inside the house. The smell of motor oil and car wax, the feel of a chamois cloth moving across curved metal, the satisfaction of seeing chrome restored to mirror brightness, these became rituals that provided structure and purpose and a sense of accomplishment that could be measured, could be seen, could be appreciated. As decades passed and new generations of automobiles replaced these 1950s classics, something unexpected happened. The cars that had been everyday transportation, that had been taken for granted, that had been traded in for newer models, suddenly became precious. The ones that had survived gained value not just in dollars, but in cultural significance. Car clubs formed around specific makes and models. Collectors sought out barn finds, vehicles that had been stored away and forgotten. Restoration became an industry, with specialists who could recreate original paint colors, who could source correct parts, who could return a rusted hull to showroom condition. The old cars began appearing at gatherings, at shows, at cruise nights where enthusiasts brought their restored vehicles to share with others who understood. These events created communities bound by appreciation for engineering and design that was never entirely utilitarian, that always contained elements of art and aspiration. Owners stood beside their cars and told stories, recounting where they'd found the vehicle, what condition it had been in, how many hours they'd invested in restoration. But they also told the other stories, the human stories, the memories of why this particular model mattered, of who had driven one when they were young, of what it represented about a time that seemed simpler in recollection, though it had been complicated enough while being lived. The nostalgia for these vehicles is not simply longing for better cars. It is longing for the era they represent, for the cultural moment they embodied. It is nostalgia for a time when the future seemed knowable and bright, when problems seemed solvable, when prosperity seemed permanent. It is nostalgia for a specific kind of American confidence, for the belief that the nation was on the right trajectory, that tomorrow would be better than today, that progress was not just possible but inevitable. But perhaps the truest reason these cars endure in memory and in preservation is simpler and more profound. They were witnesses. They were present for the living of lives, for the accumulation of moments that comprise existence. They carried us to jobs and schools and churches and parties. They transported us to funerals and weddings and births and departures. They waited patiently while we worked and shopped and visited and explored. They asked little beyond fuel and maintenance and occasional repair. They gave in return mobility and freedom and privacy and shelter. They became, in ways both practical and emotional, members of the family. The light catches chrome differently now when we see these old cars at shows and gatherings. It's not just the metal that glows, it's the memories, the associations, the weight of personal and collective history. Each car is a time machine of sorts, capable of transporting us backward not through physics, but through emotion, through sensory memory, through the powerful connection between objects and the lives they inhabited. The story of America's old cars is ultimately about more than automobiles. It is about a nation in motion, about a people defining themselves through movement and aspiration. It is about the democracy of the road, where anyone with a car and a tank of gas could explore, could travel, could imagine themselves going anywhere. It is about the intersection of art and industry, about what happens when designers and engineers are given freedom to create not just functional objects, but beautiful ones. It is about family and memory, about how objects accumulate meaning through proximity to the moments that matter. These vehicles endure, some carefully preserved in museums and collections, others still running on streets and highways, carrying new generations, creating new stories. They endure because they represent something essential about the American character, the restless desire to move forward, The belief that over the horizon lies something better. The conviction that freedom includes the freedom to go, to travel, to explore, to see what's beyond the next curve in the road. And in quiet garages and careful showrooms, beneath protective covers and soft lighting, these old cars wait still. They wait with patience earned through decades, with chrome that still catches light, with paint that still gleams, with interiors that still smell faintly of upholstery and time. They wait as testament to an era, as proof that function and beauty can coexist, as reminders of who we were, and perhaps hints of who we might yet become. They wait, these old cars, like memories made tangible, like dreams made metal, like the past that refuses to be entirely past because it is preserved, cherished, remembered, and occasionally, gloriously, driven once more down streets that have changed while the cars somehow have not, carrying with them still the promise of the open road.